Welcome to the Faith Today podcast. I'm Sammy Trema.
And I'm Bill Flederis.
Bill, you had the chance to speak with Andy Harrington about some of the challenges and opportunities with his work. What came up in the conversation?
So this work is relating to international aid or foreign aid or humanitarian assistance. Andy's the head of the Canadian Foodgrains Bank, an association of 15 church groups that are working to fight hunger all around the world. We talked about what are the current issues that people that are working in that sector are facing. The number one issue is financial cutbacks by governments, which has really hampered and challenged their work. He goes into a lot of detail about that, so it's worth listening to understand. It's a bit more complex than sometimes we even think. For me, I think foreign aid is really important. I think Christians are called to, love our neighbor, even our neighbor around the world. Working that out is tricky and complicated. We need God's wisdom for that, and I think Andy shows that he's got a lot of wisdom, and there's some really good people working in that sector.
So it sounds like we'll walk away with some new education and hopefully just encouragement to say, this is how we can come alongside these organizations and just be praying for them. So looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I feel like my prayer life has changed since this interview. We'll see what the listeners think.
Awesome.
Welcome, Andy. The partnership that you direct, Canadian Foodgrains Bank, has just released a report called Meeting the Moment. It explores the range of issues facing humanitarian agencies today. I learned two new terms when I was reading your report, and I wondered if you could explain them to our audience. One is polycrisis, and the other is protracted crisis. So what are these?
Well, thanks for having me on, Bill. I really appreciate that. Those are two terms we're using in our world to really try and explain what's happening in this wider context at the moment. So I'll start with the first one, polycrisis. So it used to be that a crisis would happen around the world. It might be a drought, it might be a war, it might be an earthquake, it might be some kind of economic disruption, and you would just deal with that crisis. The crisis would finish, you would move on. That's actually not what's happening at the moment. What's happening now in our current context is that one crisis is merging into another. And so a number of countries, whilst they might be suffering, say, an earthquake or a drought, will also be suffering maybe a war. They could be suffering a displaced person crisis. It could be a major economic disruption that's happening. I'll give you an example. I was in South Sudan just about a year ago now. That's a country that's the youngest country in the world. It has been fighting a war almost since the day it was birthed. And so for the last 12 years, it's been at war. It's also dealing with a war just across the border in Sudan. So there's a refugee crisis where people are flooding from one country to the other. It has a major drought on, climate change is hitting it, and it's been hit by one economic crisis after another, largely due to some of the things that are happening around the world, whether it was COVID or it was the grain disruptions that came out after the Ukraine war, or in our current context in Iran, the blockage of the Straits of Hormuz, which is sending prices up around the world. So the poor people in South Sudan are dealing with stuff coming at them in every direction. And so that's what we're dealing with. So probably over 75 to 80% of the countries we're working at the moment, 37 countries, would be in a polycrisis, as it were. And that's something that's new. So that would be that. A protracted crisis could be any one of those things that is lasting for over 5 years. And so back in 2014, there were 5 protracted crises in the world. This year just gone, there are 29. And so those would be major crises. They would be the long term of a long-lasting drought. And we're seeing droughts last longer and longer. They could be a long-lasting war. They could be the economic crisis that was started off because of the start of COVID that hasn't yet worked its way through the cycle. So what that basically means, you put those things together, the polycrises, the protracted crises, it means that people are struggling for longer in more difficult situations with less and less survival routes and escape routes for them. And so organizations like ours that are involved in international aid and humanitarian and relief work are trying to deal with things coming at us from every level as we try and basically keep people alive or help them flourish.
And I can imagine for people in Canada, I'm remembering the tsunami that came, I don't know, in the early 2010s. And so it was a one-time disaster. I imagine that lots of people saw the need, donated money or whatever. There was help to rebuild, and that's the end of it. But this is something very different. I'm imagining that it's harder to keep people supportive
Yeah.
or aware of something because we all lose focus after a while. If something lasts for 5 years, it's
Yeah.
hard to keep our attention on it. Is that true?
Yeah, very much so. And actually, I was very involved in the response to the tsunami. So within 5 days of it happening, I was on a plane out to Sri Lanka in 2005, just around, I think it was the Boxing Day 2004 tsunami, wasn't it? So I headed up a lot of the relief efforts for the organization I was involved in at the time, Youth for Christ in Sri Lanka.
Oh, wow.
And part of my job was to mobilize support from around the world, and it poured in. I mean, we were inundated with donations, with supplies. And so we were able to basically open up a whole bunch of schools that had been completely closed down, well, actually destroyed by the tsunami. We were able to open up schools in safe areas for over 25,000 children within 3 weeks. And that was because people were saying, this is a crisis. We can get hold of this one crisis. And it was a large scale crisis, but people understood it. I think the problem we have at the moment, you've alluded to, Bill, and you're exactly right, is that so many things coming from so many different directions. And also some of these things, to be honest, they're man-made crises that are coming out of our desire for power or whatever it might be. I think people are just trying to figure out, how can I help? What can I be involved in? And some people are just throwing their hands up and saying, man, it's just too much. And another part of that, and we have to understand that as people are involved in the international sphere, we have a cost of living crisis here in Canada ourselves and around the Western world. And so a number of people are saying, look, we should look after our own. Now, I get that. I understand that. I believe we should look after our own. But when I look at the level of crises that we're dealing with in places like South Sudan or Gaza or Lebanon or Yemen or Sudan, which is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, we're dealing with a whole different level of disaster. And I'll say some more perhaps later on in terms of the amount of people that are projected to die because of the shortfalls we have in humanitarian funding. So I really understand. I feel it myself. I get emails every day, appeals, asking for people to help me to be involved in these things. But I believe as human beings, and particularly as Christians, we have an absolute duty to be engaged in working with what the Bible calls the least of these. So you're right. There is a real fatigue in a sense. But at the same time, that means we should be trying harder, not putting our heads in the sand, I think.
Yeah. You kind of alluded to things like wars, and I know in the report it talks about the increase in the number of global conflicts.
Yeah.
I wrote some notes down, something like in the 1990s, there were 30 or 40 global conflicts. And then in 2024, we're at 61 global conflicts. So that's quite an increase. And then obviously the number of people that are displaced when a war happens skyrockets as well. So,
Yeah.
and I think people get overwhelmed by the politics involved in war. Like, who can you believe? You know, both sides are saying they're in the right. And so people throw up their hands. And I guess I'm just expressing sympathy for your work.
Yeah.
It's very challenging to try to tell a story like that. It's easy to tell a story to say, there was a tsunami. Look at all the stuff that got wrecked. We need to fix it, right? That's easy to tell. But to say there's a war and the war keeps changing and
Yeah.
there's people that keep on suffering and new people are suffering.
Yeah. Phil, that is a very astute comment. As you've said, we have seen a rising conflict around the world. Now, I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think the breakdown of international law, or the breakdown of a world order, a bipolar world where we had, back in the 80s and before, we had the kind of two big blocks. We don't have that anymore. We have countries that were superpowers now flexing their muscles and really becoming almost predatory in the way that they're acting around the world, wherever they may be. And what that's led to in places where I go to, such as Sudan or some of the other countries, or Lebanon that I was in not long ago as well, it's led to the ability for power blocks to think, I can use force, I can use violence to get what I want. And as we are seeing, it is not working. All it's causing is much more suffering and horror around the world. We're not seeing peace grow. Nobody seems to be winning here. From the perspective of someone looking in from the outside on the kind of work that we do at Canadian Foodgrains Bank and elsewhere, it might seem as though we're fighting a losing battle. But I would say that every single life that we're touching, every single human being that we're allowing to survive, to find dignity, to flourish, is absolutely worth it. Last year, we worked with nearly 1.2 million people around the world through our members and the partners that we have on the ground. I've just come back from Kenya. I met a lot of people there who were just so grateful for the work that we do and through the work we do for the many, many Canadians that support that. So you're right. It's a bit soul destroying, if I'm really honest, looking at the numbers, but I always try and go back to the fact that there are real human beings involved in this. You mentioned about displacement and refugees. There's 123 million people that have been displaced from their homes due to conflict around the world. That is biblically high. That's unbelievably high. And they're not just people who are losing their homes, they're losing their livelihoods. I met refugees in a camp on my last trip to South Sudan who had lost, one person lost 14 members on the journey of getting through Sudan, 14 family members on the journey of getting through Sudan to there. Just horrendous stuff. And many of them are actually food producers. Many of the farms that produce food, particularly in Africa, very small scale, smallholder farms, the size of your garden, but they contribute an enormous amount to the food of Africa. Suddenly that's gone. It's destroyed. Those farms aren't operational anymore. So that leads to more hunger. So yeah, that's where the polycrisis comes in, but also that's why we need to care. We need to be alongside those people doing what we can. And we also need to tell the politicians that are causing this to happen, just stop. This is not right.
So that's the global context that we're working in. Tell us a little bit maybe about what Canadian Foodgrains Bank is doing and how it operates. My take from the outside is that it's kind of a coalition of, if I'm remembering right, 15 different church-related agencies. So they're pooling their resources, but I suppose they're also each having individual partner relationships in some countries as well, right?
Yeah, you've nailed it, Bill. So we're an organization of 15 members, all coming from a Christian faith background. And the beautiful thing about it is we all come together around this vision of an end to hunger. And so you've got Pentecostals and Catholics and Baptists and Anglicans and Lutherans and all these 15 member agencies that represent actually over 30 denominations across the country. And normally if you would get a group like that together, you'd expect theological arguments or doctrine arguments to break out. But they don't, because everybody recognized that God desires no person to go hungry. And so we unite around this desire to see the world fed. And so those 15 members then work with hundreds of local partners around the world. And so that's one of the kind of sweet spots of the Canadian Foodgrains Bank. We don't send workers around the world to do our work. We work with local people on the ground who know the situation better than I do. We work in kind of three major ways. The first one is we do emergency food relief. So in a time of absolute emergency, we will be on the ground distributing food. It might be literally distributing food. It might be a culturally appropriate box of food or basket of food for a family of 6 for a month. It might be cash, because a lot of research has shown that if you give cash to people in those situations, they can spend it appropriately on food. And when people are starving, they will spend it on food. But it also gives them dignity to be able to go and spend their own money rather than taking a handout. It might be a voucher. It can be a voucher to a supermarket if a supermarket is active. So that's one thing we do, and that is life-saving. We tend to work at areas of extreme hunger. So we're not talking about someone who's missed a meal. These would be people who are right on the edge of extreme acute food insecurity. That's one thing. The second thing is longer-term development. We're very aware that to solve the problems of the world, we can't always go into emergencies and just give food and then disappear. And so we do an awful lot of long-term work to build food security around the world. We tend to work with smallholder farmers, working with hundreds of thousands at any one time around the world through our members and partners. We have a couple of techniques that we use and a couple of technologies that we use that allow them to grow food, in climatically difficult conditions as the climate changes, but also to increase their yield. So one project I just came back from visiting has been operational from 3 years and is seeing to 30 to 50% yield increases right across the board. And that's a huge amount of food extra in the system, feeding those families, but also feeding their communities. So we do a lot of that around the world. And then we also work here, and this is part of what I'm doing chatting with you, Bill, is we work here to educate Canadians and governments as to the causes of food insecurity and what we can do about that. So we have a big work that works in public engagement to get people understanding why the world is the way it is around food. And we also work in Ottawa and with other governments around the world to see policies put in place, or hope to see policies put in place, that help us to meet the needs of people around the world as we look at a growing amount of hunger. And hunger is growing around the world. So we're very keen that the Canadian government stays involved in that.
I'm imagining, because you've got all these different Christian traditions, I'm wondering, and I never thought of this before until we were just talking now, that maybe that's advantageous in the sense if you've got a local partner that has a particular theological tradition, is it easier to say, oh, the brother or sister church in Canada can be the face of the Canadian Foodgrains Bank or the partner with, like if it's a Pentecostal group in
Yeah.
Canada and maybe there's a Pentecostal group in South Sudan or wherever, right? Does that
Yeah,
ever happen or?
Oh, all the time, Bill. So the
Yeah.
partners really come across a wide range of spectrum. So we don't just work with Christian organizations, we work with all organizations that can deal with hunger. Our strap line is a Christian response to hunger, not Christians ending hunger. It's a Christian response to hunger. So we don't observe any differences in the people that we work. They're all human beings, all made in the image of God. One of the benefits of the Food Grains Bank is that we are working with, say, let's use ERDO, Emergency Response and Development Overseas, which is the Pentecostal Church of Canada's response arm. That is able to work with Pentecostal churches around the world that are doing good relief and development. CLWR, Canadian Lutheran World Relief, which is our member here, works with the Lutheran World Federation, which is a fantastic development agency. ADRA Canada works with ADRA around the world, the Adventists. And so they're able to work with their partners around the world. Now, they also work with other partners as well. They may not be the local church. Our part of that, and this is where holistic work comes in from a theological perspective. You know, if you look at the work of Jesus in the Bible, he talks an awful lot about salvation, but he also talks an awful lot about suffering and poverty and ending that and justice. And so we're able to fund some of those members who then fund their partners to do the kind of relief part, you know, the social justice side of the gospel. I always think the cross has two components. It has the vertical part where we reach up to God and God reaches down to us in the person of Jesus and we're saved. But it also has the horizontal part where Jesus reaches out to the world and said, come on, come and reach with me. So we're able to fund church partners, and we very much keep to the relief side of that, but are very aware that in a holistic sense, that's giving them the opportunity to do all sorts of community development, evangelism, discipleship, leadership training, whatever it might be, because people know, hey, you're not just talking to us, you're feeding us, you're helping us in a very material way in places where it's really, really needed. So yeah, that's a major part of what we do.
That's really cool. One of the things that I actually admire about the report is it was quite frank about it's challenging to try to empower local partners, to treat them fully as partners when we're all operating from this kind of heritage of, you know, the rich Western nation comes in and has good intentions maybe, but it's not really aware of the nuances of local culture. And, you know, we have all these horror stories that we're starting to understand as we re-examine history from our more sensitized perspective today. So the report acknowledges that there's challenges to trying to treat everyone as an equal partner. And I wonder if you could explain that a little bit to some of the folks in the audience that might not have thought a lot about that.
Yeah. You know, it's such an interesting thing, and it's something at Canadian Foodgrains Bank, we're quite passionate about because we work through local partners. And so we want our local partners to be taking the lead on this. But the reality is that in the Western world, we still have a kind of almost post-colonial view of how aid works. You know, we decide what the priorities were. When I say we, it can be governments. It's not necessarily CFGB. It's the funders. It's the institutions. People tend to have a mindset that if we do this and do this and do this, we will solve this problem. And it's often worked out at a high level. And then by the time it gets to the partner who's interested in, you know, getting the finance because they're just desperate in their situation, there's all these kind of rules and ideas and input. And so basically they can often find themselves jumping through hoops to meet the objectives that the people over here in the West think are really important that may or may not have relevance to what they're doing there. And so I've been in numerous conversations with partners over the years, just saying, you know, we're going to do this because it's going to meet 50% of what we need, but it should be meeting 100% of what they need because they should be driving this, right? And that's where I think the system is falling down. Now, to be fair, there's been a lot of conversation about that. I think if you were to bring almost any international aid practitioner from Canada or probably from the West into this conversation, they'd all agree with what I've just said. We're all, you know, trying to work on it, but progress has been slow because it's hard to change the bureaucracy. It's hard to change the way we do things. And also it means different things in different organizations. There's no kind of shared context for what it means to give local power for local people to have agency. So I think also we've got to be careful that we don't just dump out. There's a thing called risk dumping, actually. Here in the West, we tend to be very risk averse in terms of, is this money going to be used well? And so we're going to layer this clause and that clause and this clause. And so I think there's a worry that the way we would work this out is just dump all the risk onto our local partners so that they take the blame if it goes wrong. So Canadian Foodgrains Bank, we have a slightly different point of view on that, but we're very much part of the system. Because we work through local partners, we spend as much time as we can hearing from them, listening to them, trying to provide the needs that they want. But we're still subject to this overarching kind of aid system that we're all part of. So I think there's much more we could do on that. And I think the most important thing is to make sure we listen to the people in place who know what they need and know the way to do it.
Yeah, I'm just picturing how everyone has such good intentions, right? Like the Canadian donors are like, I want to donate money, but I want it to be used well. My idea of using it well is XYZ.
Exactly.
And then the person on the ground, let's say the poverty-stricken place or the disaster-hit place, is like, the first priority our community needs is ABC.
Yeah, but we're over here saying we'll do N.
Yeah. If they don't line up, then you've got a lot of juggling to do. And I can see that it would feel like being a bit straitjacketed.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think, as I say, I think there's a real growing awareness of this. And so I do believe that the change is going to happen, and it's going to happen in the near future, especially because of some of the terrible cuts we've seen to aid recently. We're going to have to rely more and more on local partners. But at the same time, it's taking time. It's taking time. And when you're in a situation where you are desperate, if you want ABC and someone's coming to you and said, well, I don't want to do ABC, but I'll do J and L, you'll do J and L and try and find ways to meet ABC through it as well. Why not just do ABC?
Yeah. You talked about how things are changing, and so maybe we should get into that a little bit. I was reading in the report, I mean, we've all heard news headlines about the United States government making changes to reduce their foreign aid and to, I think, even shut down their main government-related foreign aid department or whatever. But the numbers astounded me, in this report. I made some notes here. We're talking billions of dollars. I think it said the United States reduced its contributions to humanitarian response plans by 74% between 2024 and 2025 in 1 year.
Yeah.
And the report says, as a result, in 2025, less than 30% of global humanitarian funding requirements were met, leaving millions without essential aid.
Yeah, and it's getting worse.
I can hardly wrap my head around you operating in an environment like that where everything's shifted so drastically.
Oh, Bill, let me tell you I'll give you some facts, but I'd like to bolster up with stories, my personal experiences of this, if that's okay. So,
please.
So you're right. We saw a growth actually in development funding during COVID. So there were so many needs around the world, and countries were very generous. The Canadian government was generous and increased its funding to meet those needs. It then cut back a bit and went back to the kind of pre-COVID levels. But last year was a disastrous year, largely driven by the end of USAID, which was the American government's development arm. And if you remember the story, the news pictures of Elon Musk, who led Doge and said, I'm going to take a chainsaw to this corrupt organization. Well, he did. And it wasn't a corrupt organization. We worked with USAID. We didn't receive funding from USAID, but we worked in complementary work with USAID projects around the world. There were great projects. There were one or two, like everything else, that wasn't, didn't quite work out. Their bureaucracy was a bit worse than most, but man, they made a difference. They totally, made a massive impact on things like malaria prevention, AIDS prevention, huge works around nutrition and health care. And suddenly it just ended, and there was no phase down. It was just like, this is over. 19-year-old computer hackers were walking into USAID's headquarters and deciding what they were going to cut and just destroyed it. And in the end, they destroyed the whole thing. And so what that meant was that, and just specific to USAID, and I'll come on to the wider world in a minute, as the numbers you said were correct. We lost 74% of funding in 1 year. And that will be worse this year. Okay, so we're looking at figures that are actually going to be worse. And The Lancet, which is a really well-respected medical journal in the UK, one of the most historically respected journals around, that has said that those cuts alone from USAID will cause 14 million more deaths by 2030. Now, just
Oof.
try and wrap your head around that.
I
And
can't.
and
That's more than a war. That's more than most
that's
wars.
it's crazy. And let me bolster that with a story. So when I was in South Sudan, we were there just as that information was coming out. And I said there was no ram down. I mean, there was no ram down. So at one point, I was standing outside a childhood malnutrition center that was funded by, it was a UN childhood malnutrition center in a camp called Awil, about 70 kilometers from the Sudan border. I was standing outside, and the kind of coordinator of that center came and talked to me. I was talking to the people there. We planned to film a video, but we actually decided not to because it was so distressing.
Mm.
And he told me, "You've got to help us. You're Canadians. You've got to help us." I said, "Well, we've got other projects to do. This is really important. Why do you need us?" He said, "Because I've just been told this childhood malnutrition center is closing down tomorrow." Now, what I was looking at that point, and I was actually surrounded by mothers and fathers clutching children with distended bellies. These were kids right on the edge of death. And they were desperate. And one or two of them were trying to give me their babies. It was literally at that level. Say, take them to Canada. You've got to save them. Now, can you imagine doing that with your own kid, Bill, right? It was
Yeah.
really heartbreaking. And then I found out, in a conversation the next day, I found out that was only one of 1,100 childhood malnutrition camps that was being closed in South Sudan alone that week. The next day I was in a village. And one of the things that some of those leaders in America were saying, well, no one's going to die. Well, next day I was in a village where 2 people died that day, or died the day before, because the food rations had been cut off. WFP, World Food Program, had their food supplies cut. So this has been atrocious. And it's been done so badly. I mean, there was no real investigation. There was no real understanding of what was a good project, what was a bad project. It was just, we're going to stop this. And unfortunately, 16 other countries have followed suit, including Canada. Canada just cut 2.7 billion Canadian dollars from its aid budget for the next 4 years. And that is a very un-Canadian thing to do at a time when people are starving and are desperate around the world. And so, to go to your point, we have had to cope with this. And some of our partners on the ground have really had to cope with it. We have one partner in Ethiopia that was doing a massive work across Ethiopia, that lost 75% of his workforce in a couple of months. Cuts everywhere. And it basically comes down to the fact that people are going to die. And I can tell you, Bill, from having been there, as I watched these workers that were told that they were part of some kind of corrupt institution, sobbing, absolutely sobbing, not for themselves, but for the people that they're working with, that they had to go next day to say, I'm sorry, we're cutting off all your food. We're closing your hospital. We're shutting down your water well system, whatever it might be. That has been devastating, personally to watch, but also, and more importantly, devastating for the people in the field. That's why we have to care. That's why we have to step up and not step back right now.
Wow. I'll let that sink in for a minute. So what kind of things Canadian agencies are doing? I guess I see some of those things outlined in the report that I was looking at, talking about deciding what are the core things to keep going, and maybe let go some of the non-core things where possible, trying to strengthen good partnerships, and seeking greater collaboration and efficiencies and things like that. How's that going? Do you have any stories of within your infrastructure at the Foodgrains Bank of that kind of thing happening?
Let me do a part 1 and a part 2, because it's still early days, but yes, there are the early signs of that happening. Let me come on to that. So on the wider sense of what this means, what it basically means is we're having to do what's called hyper-prioritization right across the international development world. So it used to be that you would have an appeal that would say this is for this amount of people that would come out of the UN, and then we'd all take our little part of it. But what that's meant is we're now having to prioritize those at the very, very worst, stages of poverty, and in our case, in hunger. I don't want to get too technical, but there's a system that classifies hunger for severe hunger around the world. It's called the International Phase Classification System. It goes from a 1 to 5. So Canada's not on that system. If we were on it, we'd be about -10, right? So this is for places where there's really severe hunger. And so in the past, we were able to work at level 2, which is like, this is severe, but we can get in. If we deal with it now, we can head off a crisis. About 5 years ago, we had to move to level 3 because funding was getting tighter and there were more and more people getting hungry. So level 3 is like acute hunger here. This is really very serious. Well, what's happening now is we're moving to level 4 and 5. Level 4 is right on the edge of famine. Level 5 is famine. And so while we still try and do some of those, level 3 stuff, we're basically having to prioritize and work with the people that are going to die if we don't work with them. Well, what that means is that more and more people are going into that level because we're not doing the preventative work, right? And so that is critical. And so there's that hyper prioritization that's happening. I think the other negative, well, there are many negatives on this, but another negative is that because of that, if you go back to the beginning of our conversation, the fact that there are more crises and they're happening at the same time, polycrises, one of the works we've been trying to do is what we call nexus work, where we're actually joining some of that emergency work with longer term work. So we're staying in an area longer. We're not fixing, but we're working in the emergency. And then we're saying, hey, we're not going to leave you now. We're not going to leave you because we think this could come back. So we're going to layer on some other work, which is going to be longer term work. So it might be we've given someone 6 months of emergency food assistance, but then we're working with them to reinvigorate their farmland or,
Right.
to help them grow more crops. That's getting harder and harder to do because we're having to shift funding more onto the humanitarian side. So those are the parts of that are really a problem. There are many other parts as well, but those would be 2 highlights. You asked a great question there. Are we seeing the ways this is working out in food grains? How are we responding? There are a number of ways. We're listening more to our partners. We've conducted a whole bunch of sessions around the world recently with partners to say, right, what do you really need? Where should we be prioritizing? So really trying to combat that thing we talked about earlier of saying, we'll decide over here. We are listening more now. I think we're setting up more communities of practice. So rather than saying, here's a project over here, we did around 135,000 projects last year. And so rather than saying, here's a project over here, you get on and do it, we're now saying to people, let's find ways in which you can learn from each other. So we're setting up communities of practice and learning where people are saying, well, I'm in Angola or not Angola, so I'm in Zambia or I'm in Zimbabwe and I'm in Pakistan sometimes, and bringing people together so they can learn from each other. And then we're learning from them as well. So I think there are ways in which we are working together and ways in which we're learning. But the reality of the situation is we should be doing a lot better. We should not be cutting back on funding for international aid. And there are very good reasons why we shouldn't be doing that, actually, not just morally imperative ones, but really quite self-interest ones as well. So we're trying to learn, we're trying to grow, we're trying to see better in the organization. We're just about to enter a whole strategic planning process, and this will be a key part of that. But it's against the background of rising hunger, rising deaths, rising crises, and a bit of a mess out there. That's not where I want to finish this conversation, by the way. I'd like to finish this on hope, because I think there is hope, but that's the answer to your question.
Of course, yeah. What are some examples of hope that you do see then? Obviously, it sounds like you've got some wisdom as an organization to say there are things we can do to respond to this situation. So, I mean, that to me, that's hopeful.
I tend to be a very hopeful person, and I think that gets harder and harder every time I turn on the news. So, I've abandoned Twitter a year ago because I just couldn't watch that cesspool anymore. And, there's so much stuff that bombards us. I think we as Christians have to be a people of hope. And so I have hope in a number of ways. The first one is that, I'm seeing it in our projects. So 2 weeks ago, I was in Kenya and I was looking at one of our sort of projects that we're running with a bunch of members that have come together with a bunch of local partners. So it's a combined project. It's actually across 4 countries. It's a great project, a really cool project that's involved in reclaiming parts of the world that have been absolutely overgrazed or overused or have been eroded that used to be great farmland. And it's using natural sources as well as some of our technological sources to do that. And so as part of that, I stood just on the side of a mountain. I want to tell you, Bill, I always try and avoid Disney references whenever I start talking about the work we do, but I'm going to use one. It looked just like Pride Rock from Simba, the Lion King. It looked just like it. When we started our work 3 years ago, it was bare, it was barren, all the soil had been eroded, all the trees had been chopped down, which meant water, when the floods came, was rushing down into the valley below. The farmland had been destroyed, and it was just barren. The springs had dried up because it was rush water. There was no retention of the water. It was bad 3 years ago. 2 weeks ago, I stood on that rock I stood at the foot of a spring that had come back. I looked around. There was lush vegetation everywhere. Partners had planted 40,000 churches, 40,000 trees. Kind of an analogy there. Trees of light. Trees on the side of that mountain. Farms were coming back. There was birds flitting around. I couldn't believe it had happened in 3 years. But it happened because we'd allowed nature to regenerate itself and had used certain things, processes, techniques in order to make that happen. Now imagine what it's going to look like in 10 years' time. That's hopeful. People were coming out to us saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. You know, I visited a woman in Rwanda just over a year ago. She held up a sweet potato plant and it had just about 3 sweet potatoes. And she said, this was my crop a year ago. And then she had 2 people come out. It was almost like she was a real presentation guru in this village. And so she had a table with a cloth over it. She had 2 guys come out and say, right, now help me hold up this. And she said, this is my crop this year. There was 50 pounds of sweet potatoes and there were 3 of them holding it. She'd been on the project for a year. So there's hope in that sense. But Bill, I also think there's a wider hope. I think we can be overwhelmed with the bad news in the world at the moment. And we can lose sight of the fact that God is actually doing a lot more behind our backs than he's doing in front of our faces. And I think that there's a wider story at play here. My grandparents grew up during the Second World War. And I think probably at that time they all thought, oh my gosh, the world is 1939 in England or 1940 in the Battle of Britain that they lived through. One grandparent carried a small incendiary bomb out of the back of their sofa outside when they were 10 years old. You must have felt in these times in history, man, this is the end. It's the worst it can get. So history is full of blips like the one we're living through now, but God is eternal. And so I think there is a hope in God as well. And that's why I do the work I do, because I want to be part of building that new creation that we're looking forward to. And the work we do on earth now really does count, especially when we think about the world that is to come. So there is a hope. And so I would encourage everyone who's listening to this not to get disheartened, not to get downhearted, not to look at people in those other countries and call them those people or them, those others. We're all human beings. Every one of us valuable, made in the image of God. The world is a poorer place for every one of those 14 million extra people that will die for not being in it. We'll lose them. So we have to do everything we can in the hope that it's going to get better in the short term in terms of what we do if we do good things, but in the absolute knowledge, faith, and conviction that in the long term, it is going to be a heck of a lot better because God is going to take hold of this and redeem it all. That's our job, to be part of that redemption, to be ambassadors of reconciliation, whether it's making sure that someone can eat now and their kids can eat, or whether it's believing in a future that is going to get better, because it is, even though it's hard to believe at the moment.
So if people get a feeling like that is a vision I share, I would like to do something to support that, what are some things that we can do to either, I don't know, stay educated or, I mean, obviously donate money is, I'm sure, a big help. I wonder if you could help us to think about how do we do that well, and what else does maybe the Canadian Foodgrains also need besides money?
So thank you for that, Bill. We talk about 4 ways in which people can get involved, and we talk about it within the context of Canadian Foodgrains Bank, but I think it works for any organization. You know, it could be your local food bank, whatever. So we talk about give, learn, pray, and advocate. So you've mentioned the first one. Obviously, organizations like ours need donations to continue. We get a lot of funding from the Canadian government. We have a grant that is matched 4 to 1, so that for every $1 we raise, the Canadian government will put in $4 up to $25 million a year to help feed people around the world. So giving is really important. One of the great things about the Foodgrains Bank is we have a massive supporter base, especially across rural Canada. Giving, I can't get away from, but that shouldn't be the end of it. We need to learn. We need to learn about the causes of hunger, learn about the causes of poverty, educate ourselves as to why this is happening. It's more important we do it than ever before, because there's been a lot of disinformation and a lot of delegitimization, actually, put out about organizations that are doing this kind of work. Why aren't you bringing the money back? Let's bring all the money back home and solve our problems. We give, at the last count, something like 26 cents in every $100 to international aid. We are not solving the problems of Canada with 26 cents in every $100, but we are solving the problems for tens of millions of people around the world. So learn about the causes of hunger. And then as you learn about that, advocate. Actually, before you do that, pray. Bring it back to what I said before. God is involved in this. There have been many places I've been around the world, Bill, where I've discovered God in ways I would never expect. I've heard his invitation to come and join him there. We're not taking God there. God's already there. Come and join us, he says. So pray. Pray for our leaders that are making decisions. Pray for those in need. Pray for those that are being bombed as we speak in the Middle East. And then the final one is advocate. And this is something that has been a massive part of the Christian story, the advocacy we've done through centuries, thinking of ending the slave trade, starting universal education, starting hospitals and hospices. These are all initiatives that came from the church. We've been a little lax on that in the last few decades. It's time for us to rise up and advocate again. So we're very involved in that at Canadian Foodgrains Bank. We take people to Ottawa every year to meet with their MPs. We run campaigns. You can go on our website. You can be part of a campaign now. There's actually a letter builder there. You just sign on to it, and it will be sent to the ministers involved in order to say, we really care about international funding to keep people alive. So give, learn, pray, advocate. That's certainly how we talk about it at Foodgrains, but I think that's relevant to every organization. We can make a difference in the world. One of the things the world wants to tell us at the moment is it's all about the oligarchs and the rich people. You don't count. You can't make a difference. Yes, you can. Your voice counts. We know, we have heard from MPs that if they get 5 letters or 5 phone calls, they pay attention to the issue. So make your voice count. It makes a difference.
That's excellent, Andy. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time that you've set aside to share some of these stories and your expertise and your passion. I pray that our listeners will find it as beneficial as I have.
Well, thanks, Bill. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Faith Today. We hope you've enjoyed this intentionally ad-free listening experience. You can help sustain our podcast by contributing to our publisher at theefc.ca/donate.